In the spring of 1913, the town of Opelousas, Louisiana, threw a parade for a little boy who had come back from the dead. 8 months earlier, 4-year-old Bobby Dunbar had vanished on a family fishing trip. Search parties had dragged the lake with hooks. Divers had gone under. At one point, someone even threw dynamite into the water, hoping the blast would force a body to the surface. Nothing ever came up. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. And now, somehow, he was home. His mother said she knew him by his scars. Church bells rang. Strangers lined the streets just to see him. For most of a year, the whole country had followed this story in the newspapers, and now the whole country got to watch it end well. There was just one problem. 600 miles away, in North Carolina, a woman was reading the same headlines, and she knew, with everything in her, that the boy in that parade wasn't the child the Dunbars thought he was. She believed he was hers. 92 years later, a single strip of DNA would finally settle the question neither family could put down. It would prove that one of these two mothers had spent her entire life defending a truth nobody wanted to hear. And it would reopen a second question, one that, to this day, still doesn't have an answer. This is the story of the boy who came home twice, once to a family that wasn't his, and once, decades later, to the truth. Stick with me to the end, because I don't think you'll be sure which of those homecomings was the sad one. Quick note before we go further, because this case gets tangled, and it'll help to have these straight going in. 3 families end up bound together for the next century. The Dunbars, a comfortable family in Opelousas, Louisiana, whose son goes missing. The Andersons, a poor, unmarried mother named Julia, and the son she says was taken from her. And Walters, the traveling handyman found with a boy, arrested for a kidnapping that, as you're about to hear, nobody could actually prove happened. Keep those 3 in your head. Everything that follows is what happens when all 3 collide over one small boy, and nobody, not a courtroom, not a town, not even the boy himself, can agree on who he was. To understand what happens in a Mississippi courtroom a year from now, you have to start on a normal Friday in August, in a part of Louisiana where the ground can't quite decide if it's land or water. Percy and Leslie Dunbar were comfortable people by the standards of Opelousas in 1912. Percy ran a business in town. The family had standing, the kind of standing that, as you'll see, ends up mattering a great deal later in this story. On August 23rd, they took their 2 young sons out to Swayze Lake, a stretch of water a few miles from town that everybody called a lake and nobody would have called safe. It was less a lake than a flooded forest. Cypress trees breaking the surface, water the color of strong tea, alligators nobody bothered counting anymore because there were simply too many of them. Their oldest boy was named Robert Clarence Dunbar. Everyone called him Bobby. He'd turned 4 that May. Nobody can say, even now, exactly what happened in the hour he went missing. What's certain is that sometime that afternoon, Bobby wandered off from where the family was set up, toward the water, and he didn't come back. By evening, there were dozens of men at the lake carrying lanterns. By the next day, there were more than 100, wading through mud to their knees, dragging the shallows with hooks. Boats went out over the deeper water. Bloodhounds were brought in and lost the scent at the shoreline, which told searchers nothing they didn't already fear. At one point, someone floated the idea that dynamite thrown into the deep water might force a body up to the surface. They tried that too. Nothing came up. Not one trace. For the first few days, everyone reached for the simplest, most terrible explanation. The lake had taken him, the way Louisiana swamp water sometimes did, and it didn't owe anybody a body back. Then, a day or 2 into the search, somebody found Bobby's hat, some distance from the water, on dry ground, sitting in a direction you wouldn't expect a drowned child's belongings to travel. That one detail changed the entire shape of the case. If the hat was on land, moving away from the lake, maybe Bobby hadn't drowned at all. Maybe he'd wandered off under his own power. Or And this was the word that started appearing in the Louisiana papers within the week. Maybe somebody had taken him. Percy Dunbar posted a reward, $1,000 at first, already a significant sum for 1912. As the weeks dragged on without a single solid lead, it climbed to $6,000, worth well over $100,000 today. Posters went up across the Gulf Coast, with Bobby's description printed under his photograph. Light hair going darker, blue eyes, a burn scar on the big toe of his left foot. The story didn't stay in Louisiana. Wire services picked it up within days, and for the rest of 1912, Bobby Dunbar was a name that newspaper readers from New Orleans to New York recognized on sight, the missing boy from the lake at Opelousas. One local paper said, without much exaggeration, that nothing in the parish's history had ever produced this much interest or this much grief all at once. Letters and telegrams poured in. False sightings arrived from across the South. Boys who looked a little like Bobby, spotted in a dozen different towns, chased down and ruled out one after another. Each one reopened the hope for a day or two, and each one closed it again. And then, slowly, the story went quiet, the way missing child cases in 1912 almost always did. Weeks became months. The search parties went home. Winter came to Opelousas, and the Dunbars kept the reward posted and kept following leads. But the nation's attention, the thing that had made this case feel, for a while, like it might actually get solved, moved on to other headlines. Until 8 months later, when a report arrived from 300 miles away, deep in the piney woods of Mississippi. A strange man had been seen traveling from town to town, and with him was a small boy who, more than one witness swore, looked exactly like the picture on the reward poster. The man's name was William Cantwell Walters. By trade, he tuned and repaired pianos and organs, an itinerant handyman who moved from small town to small town, taking whatever work he could find. In the rural South of 1912, that made him a stranger nearly everywhere he went, and it made him easy to notice. Once the Bobby Dunbar story had saturated newspapers in 3 states, it made him easy to suspect. The moment word reached authorities that Walters was traveling with an unexplained boy who roughly matched the missing child's description, he was arrested. Not because anyone had a shred of evidence he'd done anything wrong, but because a stranger with a small boy in a region that had spent 8 months primed to look for exactly that was already enough. Walters gave an answer immediately, and he never once changed it, not for the rest of his life. The boy's name, he said, was Charles Bruce Anderson. Bruce, to everyone who knew him, the son of a young woman named Julia Anderson, who had worked for Walters's family. According to Walters, Julia had let him take the boy on what was supposed to be a short visit to relatives. He wasn't holding a stolen child. As far as he was concerned, he was minding somebody else's son a little longer than planned. Nobody in a position to matter waited around to find out if he was telling the truth. The Dunbars were sent for. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable, and it's the part the parade version almost always leaves out. Nobody was actually sure. The newspapers covering the reunion in Mississippi couldn't even agree with each other about what happened. One account has the boy running to Leslie Dunbar, crying, "Mother," the two of them embracing on the spot, the kind of scene a headline is built around. Other accounts, filed by different reporters covering the same event, describe something colder, a boy who showed no clear sign of recognizing her at all, and a Leslie Dunbar who, in front of witnesses, said plainly that she wasn't certain this was her son. Both versions exist in the historical record. They can't both be the whole truth, and nobody living can tell you which one actually happened, or whether the truth was some uneasy version of both. What we do know is that Leslie didn't make her final determination on the spot. It was the next day, after the boy had been bathed, that she said she recognized certain moles and a particular scar, and declared, this time without any hedging, that he was Bobby. From that moment, as far as the law and the press were concerned, the case was closed. The boy was Bobby Dunbar, found. He was brought back to Opelousas to a homecoming with a parade running down the center of town, church bells, crowds lining the streets, a mother's prayers apparently answered after 8 months of silence. On its surface, it's one of the great happy endings of 1913. But while Opelousas was still celebrating, a train was already carrying a second woman toward Louisiana, and what she was about to say, in a town that had just spent 8 months and thousands of dollars building itself a happy ending, was not something anybody there wanted to hear. Julia Anderson was, by every measure that mattered to a courtroom in 1913, the wrong kind of witness. She was young, unmarried, and had already had 3 children out of wedlock, 2 of whom had died. She worked as a field hand, which in the rural South of that period placed her about as far from the Dunbars' social standing as it was possible to get. She had no money for a lawyer, and no town behind her the way the Dunbars had Opelousas behind them. By her own account, she had let William Walters, connected to the family she worked for, take her son Bruce on what was meant to be a short trip, only for that trip to stretch on far longer than she'd agreed to. When she read that Walters had been arrested with a boy being called Bobby Dunbar, she did the only thing available to her. She got on a train, rode for hours, and arrived to say, in public, in a town that had already decided how this story ended, that the boy belonged to her. What happened next is one of the crueler moments in the entire case, and it's almost never included in the short version. Authorities lined up 5 boys of roughly the same age, including the child now living with the Dunbars, and asked Julia to pick her son out of the group, not to hold him, not to examine him for the marks a mother would actually recognize, just to look, cold, at 5 children of similar size and coloring, and instantly identify which one, if any, was hers. She couldn't do it. Flustered, under pressure, surrounded by strangers who'd already decided who she was before she opened her mouth, she failed to positively pick him out on the spot. She said she wasn't sure. By the next day, it was too late. His own mother didn't know him, had already gone into papers that had spent months priming their readers to root for exactly one outcome. It didn't matter that when Julia was finally allowed to actually examine the boy the following day, properly this time, the way she hadn't been permitted to the first time, she said, without hesitation, that this was Bruce. The damage from that first staged moment was already done, and the coverage that followed made it worse. Reporters turned openly on Julia's character, her unmarried status, her children born out of wedlock, all of it laid out as though it answered the question of whether she was telling the truth about her own son. She had no lawyer to push back on any of it. The Dunbars, by contrast, had money, standing, and an entire town that had already thrown a parade for its answer. At the trial itself, Julia wasn't entirely alone. A number of people from Poplarville, Mississippi, the town where Walters and the boy had spent real time together, well before Bobby Dunbar ever went missing, traveled to testify under oath that they had seen the 2 of them together long before the disappearance. That should have mattered a great deal. It didn't change the outcome. The court ruled that the boy was Bobby Dunbar. William Walters was convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to life in prison. Julia Anderson went home to North Carolina without her son. I want to sit on that for a second, because it's easy to let the case's later twist overshadow this part. And this part is the actual injustice at the center of the whole story, not a scientific mystery. A very ordinary one. A poor, unmarried woman told the truth, in public, under enormous pressure, and was disbelieved because of who she was, not because of what she said. Everything that came afterward, decades of it, on both sides, grew out of one afternoon in a Mississippi courthouse when 5 boys were lined up in front of a mother who wasn't given the time to actually look. Walters would spend 2 years in prison before his conviction unraveled on appeal. But the boy, whoever he actually was, stayed a Dunbar, and for the next 53 years, he would live as a man who might not, in the strictest possible sense, have been himself. From here, the story splits into 3 separate lives, all shaped by that single ruling, all moving on parallel tracks for decades, without ever quite touching. Walters. After 2 years in prison, his lawyer succeeded in getting the kidnapping conviction overturned by the Louisiana Supreme Court. Prosecutors, weighing the cost of a second trial against a case that had already gone badly for them once, chose not to retry him. He walked free and went back to the itinerant life he'd always led, tuning pianos, moving from town to town. For the rest of his life, right up until his death in 1945, he told anyone who asked the exact same thing he'd told police the day he was arrested. The boy was never Bobby Dunbar. He never wavered. And by that point in his life, he had nothing left to gain by continuing to insist on it. Julia. She rebuilt her life in Poplarville, Mississippi, among the very community that had shown up in court to defend Walters. She married a man named Ollie Rawls, had 7 more children, helped found a local church, and became known around town as a nurse and midwife, the woman people sent for when someone was sick or when a baby was on the way. By every account from people who actually knew her, it was a full, respected life. But her children would say, for the rest of theirs, that she never stopped speaking of the son she'd lost. In their family, the word for what happened to him was never given up. It was always kidnapped. Julia Anderson died in February of 1940, still telling, 27 years later, the exact same story she'd told in that Mississippi courtroom. The boy. He grew up as Robert Clarence Dunbar, Bobby, in Opelousas, inside the family that had claimed him. He married, had 4 children of his own, and ran a gas station. To his kids, he was simply their father. Whatever private uncertainty he may have carried about who he actually was, he didn't build a life around it. He built an ordinary one, on top of a question nobody in his family spoke about out loud, except, and this is the part of the case that tends to stay with people, there's real evidence that some part of him never fully let it go. In 1944, a man walked into an ice plant in Poplarville where a young man named Hollis Rawls was working. Hollis was one of Julia Anderson's sons, Bruce's half-brother, if the Anderson family's version of events was the correct one. The stranger made small talk for a while, and then, almost as an afterthought, introduced himself. Bobby Dunbar, from Opelousas, Louisiana. Hollis was too stunned to say much of anything. Before he could gather himself, a customer walked in and pulled him back to work. By the time he returned, the visitor was still there, the two of them mostly just looking at each other for a while, and then the man left. It was only about half an hour later, Hollis would say decades afterward, that it actually hit him what had just happened. A man he'd spent his whole life hearing about, the brother his mother said had been taken from her, had been standing right in front of him, and he'd let him walk out the door without saying a word about it. Around that same period, Hollis's sister Jewel had an almost identical encounter. She and her husband ran a service station outside Poplarville, and a man came in, sat down, and talked with her for nearly an hour, mostly just asking questions, watching her, without ever giving his name. It was only after he left that she put it together in her own mind. She came to believe that had been Bobby. Then, in 1954, it was his own son who finally asked him outright. Bobby Dunbar Jr., who'd grown up hearing the whole legend the way every Dunbar child had, put the question to his father plainly. Who did he actually think he was? His father's answer became, over time, one of the most quoted lines in the entire case. "I know who I am, and I know who you are, and that's all that matters. It's how we live our life that counts." It isn't a denial. It isn't a confession, either. It's something closer to a man declining, calmly and for the last time, to open a door he'd spent 40 years keeping shut. And then there's the moment his youngest son, Gerald, would remember for the rest of his own life. In 1963, the family was driving home from a wedding in Ohio, passing through Mississippi on the route back to Louisiana, when 13-year-old Gerald noticed his father pointing out the car window at a building. "Those are the people," his father said, "that they came to pick me up from." He asked if they should stop. His wife said if he thought they should, so they did. He went inside alone for around half an hour. Then he came back out, and the family drove on. Nobody in that car ever asked him what happened inside. He never explained it, and he was never asked to. Was that a slip? A man who, even decades into a life built on one identity, still occasionally let the other one surface? Or was it something else entirely? A story he'd absorbed so completely, from a lifetime of newspaper clippings and family legend, that some part of him had simply come to believe it was his own memory. Nobody can say for certain, not even the people who were sitting in that car. It's the kind of detail that doesn't fit cleanly into either family's version of events. It just sits there, unresolved, the way most of this story does. In March of 1966, the man the world knew as Bobby Dunbar died of heart disease in a Houston hospital. He was 57 years old. He died carrying the name he'd held for 53 of those years. The question of who he actually was still completely unresolved. A question, as far as anyone knows, he never raised again after 1963. For more than 30 years after that, it stayed that way. A strange family story, passed down the way family stories are, softened at the edges, mostly forgotten outside St. Landry Parish. Then, in 1999, his granddaughter, Margaret Dunbar Cutright, was handed a scrapbook. Her father, the same son who had once asked his own father who he really was, gave her a collection of newspaper clippings from 1912 and 1913, the original coverage of the case. Margaret started reading them, expecting to find confirmation of the family legend she'd grown up on. Instead, she found a mess of contradictions. Articles that disagreed with each other about the identification, about Leslie's initial reaction at the reunion, about details that in the family version had always been simple, certain, and clean. So she started digging. Small-town libraries, county archives, the old defense files from Walters's kidnapping trial and appeal. And in 2000, she did something nobody in her family appeared to have done in nearly 90 years. She went and found Julia Anderson's surviving children, Hollis Rawls and Jewel Tarver, and asked to hear their side of it. What she got back was, in her own description, an upside-down mirror of everything she'd grown up believing. The Andersons had never doubted, for a single day across 3 generations, that Bobby Dunbar was actually their Uncle Bruce, kidnapped, in their family's telling, not by Walters at all, but by the Dunbars themselves. Margaret didn't believe it, not at first. She'd come looking for evidence that would finally settle the case in her own family's favor. Instead, she'd found an entire family whose certainty matched hers exactly, pointed in the opposite direction. 2 legends defended with the same conviction for 90 years that could not both be true. By the early 2000s, a reporter working on the story for the Associated Press raised an idea nobody in 90 years had actually been able to act on. Modern DNA testing could settle this for good. Bobby Dunbar Jr., the man who back in 1954 had once heard his own father dodge the exact same question, agreed to take the test. The comparison itself was straightforward. Scientists compared Bobby Dunbar Jr.'s DNA against that of his supposed first cousin, the son of Bobby's younger brother, Alonzo, whose parentage in the Dunbar family had never once been in question. If the man everyone had called Bobby Dunbar for 90 years really was Bobby Dunbar, the 2 men would share a clear, traceable genetic relationship through that line. They shared none at all. In 2004, 92 years after a 4-year-old boy vanished at a Louisiana lake, science did what no family, no lawyer, and no courtroom in 1913 had ever managed to do. It gave a definitive answer. The boy the Dunbars had raised, loved, and mourned in advance as their own had never been Bobby Dunbar. He had been Charles Bruce Anderson all along. Julia Anderson, dismissed in 1913 for failing to pick her own son out of a lineup she'd been given no real time to look at, publicly humiliated over her marital status, sent home broke and without a lawyer, had been telling the truth from the very beginning. The mother, who was shamed for not knowing her own son, turned out to be the only person in this entire case who ever truly did. The DNA test closed one question and tore open another, one that's actually older and darker than the identity mystery this case is usually remembered for. If the boy who came home in 1913 was Bruce Anderson, then the real Bobby Dunbar, the 4-year-old who wandered away from his family at Swayze Lake on an August afternoon in 1912, was never found. He wasn't rescued. He wasn't returned. He simply doesn't come back into this story at all. Margaret Cutright, after all of it, the newspaper clippings, the court records, the reunions with a second family who'd spent a century hating hers, arrived at her own conclusion, and it's a hard one. She believes her actual grandfather most likely drowned that day, in a body of water even contemporary accounts described as more swamp than lake, thick with alligators, and that his body was never recovered because there was, in the end, nothing left to recover. If she's right, then nobody was ever actually missing after that August afternoon in 1912. There was no kidnapping to solve, because there was never anyone to kidnap. There was only a 4-year-old who was already gone, and a legal system that spent the next 92 years fighting over an entirely different child. And there's a colder accounting to sit with too. William Walters spent 2 years in prison, and the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion for a kidnapping that, by every piece of evidence uncovered since, never happened at all. Julia Anderson spent 92 years, and effectively her whole life, being disbelieved about the one fact she had always, from the very first day, been right about. 2 families were fused together by one court's mistake in 1913, and then quietly, permanently fractured by it for the rest of the century. Even now, the reconciliation isn't as clean as a DNA result might suggest. By Margaret Cutright's own account, some of her own relatives resent her for reopening any of this, for turning a settled family identity, the one they'd built their whole lives on, back into an open question. To them, whatever a lab in 2004 says, Dunbar is simply who they are, and who they have always been. The DNA answered exactly one question. It left every harder one sitting right where it was before anybody ever swabbed a cheek. What a name is actually worth. What 2 families owe each other after 92 years. And whether the truth is always the kindest thing to know. Here's what I keep coming back to with this one. That boy, whoever he actually was, grew up loved. He had a mother, a father, brothers, a name, an entire life built around him. He just may never have gotten to choose whether any of it was truly his. And when his own son finally asked him point blank who he really was, he didn't answer with a name at all. He answered with a life. I know who I am, and I know who you are, and that's all that matters. So here's what I want to ask you. If you were that boy, if you found out, 50 years in, that the family who raised you might not be the family you were born into, would you want to know? Or is the family that raised you the only truth that actually matters, no matter what a lab result says decades later? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. And there's the other question, the one science never got to answer. What really happened to the real Bobby Dunbar in the summer of 1912 at a lake in Louisiana that's now mostly just a story people tell? If you've got a theory, I want to hear that too. New case next week. I'll see you then.